So, let's start with an overarching question about trade-offs here and the social and environmental trade-offs versus the financial. Did you change your perspectives after having listened to these distinguished speakers today here, or any other reflections? Would you like to start, Anna?
Of course,
all the trade-offs.
Of course I did. What great presentations we just heard. No, I think some of it confirms some thoughts. I think there is a lot of polarities in everything we do.
Maybe you also should say what Essity does for international
good idea.
Guests that might not know.
So Essity is a global hygiene and health company. It's headquartered here in Stockholm. But we are present in about 150 countries. We are on the Stockholm Stock Exchange, one of the 10 biggest companies there. We're not so known by name. We're often very known by our product brands. And I could tell you more about that later. Yeah,
please continue about the trade-offs. Your thoughts.
No, exactly. No, so the trade-offs. I think there's trade-offs and polarities in most of the things that we do as a company, and of course that applies probably also in sustainability, even within sustainability between environmental and social issues. I mean, we produce products that are helping people to live a better life, a healthy and a good well-being in their life. That provides a sustainability, so social perspective of things, right, and benefit. And could there be, of course, so that we are producing single-use products that has an impact on the environment. So there in itself, you also have some polarities that we need to look at. It's the time aspect, long-term, short-term, and those elements of that. So I think there are polarities in everything we do, not just sustainability and finance.
Thank you. Eva Halvarsson, please, your thoughts on after having listened to the distinguished speakers.
I'm now totally confused, thinking about what do I do in my day job. No, thank you for giving me fruitful thoughts. I think that I'm not quite comfortable with talking about trade-offs, actually, because I think we have trade-offs in everything that we meet every day. Just talking about trade-offs when it comes to sustainability, it's strange because every investment, I mean, all sustainable possibilities aren't giving a good return. So I don't think of that as a trade-off. I think of that as a due diligence with an investment. So I'm not sure that I like the trade-off vocabulary, but I think I'm glad to hear about what the professors here spoke about when it comes to integration. I am a firm believer that you can't have a separate department or thinking of this as something add-on. You need to have everyone in your firm thinking about how to develop what you do for the next generation. And I'm sure that all of you students sitting here wouldn't want to work in my firm if we didn't work that way. So, and you also mentioned one thing that I always talk to my investment managers about, and that is blended finance. Why don't we as financial institutions work more with the development banks? It's a perfect match, at least in theory, but in practice it's so hard to get things done.
Thank you, Eva. And your fund has divested. I'm sure most of you know this, but I'll ask you more about this later on. So Masih Yazdi, you're Chief Financial Officer at SE-banken and SEB, and you invest in companies such as Essity, and you're also stock listed, so you're in the portfolio of AP2, among others. Yes.
Yeah, we don't necessarily invest in them. Maybe we lend money to them.
Yes, that's
we typically don't talk about the actual customers we have on a name basis. But surely they're a big company, we're a big bank, so probably that's the case.
Okay. Not full disclosure here.
No.
So what would you say about your thoughts of stakeholders and the trade-offs here?
Yeah, I think I'll be a bit controversial here. I think one of the themes today has been that companies in general need to expand what stakeholders are trying to optimize towards. I'm not sure if that's the fastest path towards getting a sustainable economy. I think it's too much to ask, to be honest. I'm more on the sort of Milton Friedman camp of trying to optimize or maximize profits. But I think there's a faster path towards a sustainable economy through that path. For me, the issue is that we have a lot of things that aren't priced the way they should. We have externalities that are impacting the climate and the world and societies much more than the cost of those externalities. So if we get our act together and just price those things correctly, and companies will have to pay for those things according to the actual cost of them, then you could actually have the same formula as today, profit maximization, but then you will use less of that, and then you'll probably innovate and invest more in sustainable things, sustainable ways of producing your goods and services. I think personally that's a faster way towards, but then you have to get different politicians in different jurisdictions to align on what the cost should be and implement it across the globe, which is a big task to ask, but I still think that's easier than getting companies in general to care about sort of a broader sense of stakeholders, because it's not up to us really. I mean, even our CEO can have whatever ideas he has. He reports to the board and they report to our shareholders, and in the end the shareholders want us to maximize returns. You can maybe nudge us to maximize the returns on a sort of longer time perspective instead of 3 years, I don't know, 5 years or 10 years. So that's helpful, but it doesn't get you all the way to where we want to go, I think.
Thank you. Now, of course, I'm curious to Professor Ong's reactions to the statements here from SE-banken. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I disagree with him. I mean, look, I think that obviously, I think as Patrick mentioned, if we had a first best carbon tax, it's been talked about for 60 years. I think the train has so-called left the station on that one. I think mostly now climate policy that you see, especially in the U.S., is like in of itself also highly distortionary. Like I think the Inflation Reduction Act. I think you're also running against a lot of this kind of populist reactions now to a lot of these government plans. So certainly, I think it depends on the country. Obviously, I think if you're in China. Their system is a very different system, right? And so they've had more success, I think, with some of their climate policies, for sure. But certainly, I think in the rest of the developed world with democracies, I think it's been very challenging. That's number one. I think number two, I think as we kind of argue in this thing, I think we shouldn't also forget that there's a lot of information that governments don't have that stakeholders, workers, these guys, the agents in the economy have, right? And I think kind of one of the benefits of this kind of stakeholder approach is, I'm not saying it's going to kind of solve all the world's problems, but I think I'm more optimistic about it because, there's a lot of results that we have that show that, look, it is a very efficient system to try to generate some abatement, right, while still, minimizing costs, right? And it's not so clear, climate policy is that efficient. I mean, it's true. I mean, obviously, if you're going to frame everything as that the world is going to end, let's just throw all money at it, then sure, I guess, fine, right? But obviously, the world doesn't work like that. You can see that support for climate policy globally is very low. Right? Support for climate policy in Europe is, despite all the things about Europeans being so green, is very low. Support for climate policy in America is even lower. So I think a lot of the stakeholderism is a reaction to kind of climate policy failure. Right, as a way of trying to kind of deal with these issues, and I'm kind of thinking that at the end of the day, of course, it may take a bit longer in terms of kind of these things because obviously it's not like instantly you're going to get this carbon tax, but we're not getting a carbon tax, so this is sort of the best thing that we have. So we should try to work with it and see if we can kind of improve upon it. Make the dance halls a little more efficient, so we can kind of get everyone matched up with the right people and produce the most profits and abatement possible.
But since time is of the essence, this is urgent. Either, regardless of what theory we support here. So in terms of analyzing more, thinking more about the limits of the win-win situation here that we have been addressing on and off here today? What can you add here or contribute with your experience, Anna, from Essity, the limits of the win-win thinking here, and how can we sort of iron out some principles to navigate in the trade-off territory?
I mean, we would say, as many other companies would say, we're ambitious when it comes to sustainability, right? We know where we have our materiality, where we need to put in our efforts. I think looking at the sort of win-win, as we discussed, I think we put up, like many others, science-based target was mentioned here today also by Professor Bolton. I mean, we have them, and that to some extent is actually forcing us to look for win-wins in our own supply chain and also, up our chain as well. Because we rely on our suppliers to become a bit more sustainable and invest in more sustainable innovations, which we then need to pay for, right? Because if that's going to cost some more potentially, we need to pay a bit more. That's eventually also potentially going to cost more than for our customers. And there I could see a bit of a win-win still, because in the end that should both help us to reach those targets that we put up. Those targets are starting to move their way to be on some equal level as financial targets. We're not there yet, but like Essity, we put up science-based target is actually part of our incentive system now.
When did you sign up to the SBT?
We did that already in 2018. And it was, as we heard this earlier before, it was coming to life around 2015. So we were quite early, which means that we also updated our science-based targets. Just this year, actually, we got them approved now to be even closer to the 1.5 degrees of the Paris Agreement. It's not easy, and we're not just seeing wins here, but at the same time, we're trying to find this way of collaborating through the supply chain. We still have huge challenges around some of our CO2 because we need to find new ways of doing tissue production, which is one of our product areas that we're working in. But we need to do it because our customers are also being measured by it, who sells these types of products, and our suppliers who produce them, the raw material is also measured. So, yeah.
And you're also sort of everybody wants the biomass. The biomass is the hot stuff these days, so that's also challenging. I can imagine.
Yeah.
So Eva, I mentioned briefly that your fund has divested. How has this affected your returns?
Actually, let me start by saying that divestment is definitely not the only way to work with sustainability. I think that we and many investors started out that way to define the
May I
risks
ask when?
that we
Because
saw.
the audience might not be aware of this. When did you decide to divest?
Oh, we have done that in separate buckets, but the last time maybe it was 5 or 6 years ago. Yes. So we also have, well, at that point, we have a big quant way. We invest with 3 different investment styles, but let's not talk so much about that. But 5 years ago, we decided to implement something called the Paris-aligned index. And through that, by doing so, we also divested from a number of fossil companies. But I want to add that we talk about this a lot, if we should be rolling out a transition portfolio with the brown companies turning green, because there's not time to wait for all the companies to become dark green. So we try to identify those being on the right track.
So the number 2s?
The number 2s,
yes.
Exactly. And coming back to the Paris-aligned index, we can see that that index over 10 years' time has outperformed a normal market-weighted index. So we haven't lost any money. And that is our firm belief that sustainability pays off, and we are lucky to have a long-term objective and are supposed to create a good pension for all of those of you that are Swedish citizens. I'm handling your money here, and we try to give you a good return.
I think she wants to add more applause here. Does that
and trying to do that with sustainable investments. So I think very much of the time perspective is important when you talk about trade-offs. We can have the long-term hat on.
Thank you. Excellent work. So I'd like to turn to you, Marci, from the bank perspective in terms of long and short term in conflicting interests, or conflicting interest between the short and the long term perspective. That's more the correct framing here. What could you say about this from your perspective?
Well, I can give you a concrete example. My view is that all paths to success is through mistakes. So if you take Sarah's example of green steel, for example, if we decide to lend money to a company that's trying to do green steel, that's clearly going to be in the short term higher risk than just doing conventional steel, because conventional steel, they have the cash flows. Green steel, there's no production, they don't have any cash flows. But the only way green steel can be successful is if there is capital being allocated towards it, and they'll probably make mistakes. So if we as a first bank invest in that, it's possible we actually get losses. We do credit losses because we did the first investment. But that first investment is necessary for that company to learn from its mistakes to be successful in the future. But then other banks can come in this sort of brighter future and do the lending at that point. So how should we think about that? Should we do the investment now? Should we wait until this sort of production is more mature? Obviously, we want to be a forward-leaning bank. We're one of the green banks that you mentioned there. Our brand is green, so we are green by definition. So we want to do that, but the
logo is green.
The logo is green, yeah. But it's clearly a trade-off. It's absolutely a trade-off, and you have so many of these trade-offs. And I think what Sarah said there is extremely important. You have to start with acknowledging the trade-offs. I'm not sure that sustainability leads to better returns. I'm not sure of the opposite either. Maybe in the sort of 50-year perspective, but you could have, last 2 years it's been negative to be a sustainable fund because all companies have done well. But that doesn't matter. It doesn't say that we shouldn't be doing it, but I think acknowledging the truth is always good no matter what you do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for speaking it so clearly. So, any dance theories applicable to this?
Yeah, I thought all the comments were great. I think I've been thinking a little bit about Sarah's kind of long run and Patrick's sovereign wealth fund. I think the one stakeholder that's missing in the dance hall is basically, the future generations, right? They're not.
Thank you for saying that.
I think kind of the problem, government was supposed to kind of fix that. At least if you kind of. They should, but maybe AI can kind of generate versions of your grandkids, stick them into the boardroom, and then, stick them into the thing and have them basically have a vote, right, because I think kind of the system works okay. It's just that we're not generating enough abatement because I think the preference is, right, we're not internalizing enough, even as the current stakeholders, right, the future damage. And I think if you had these other stakeholders, your future self or your future grandkids at the table, and if you could imagine the alternative universes that they would be in, you might generate a much bigger abatement outcome. Yeah, I think that's kind of more the fundamental problem. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing this perspective. So before we start taking the Menti questions, let's take one more question, and it's for you, Eva. This summer there was an interview in Dagens Nyheter with the CEO of the industrial company Epiroc. And they make drills for mines, etc. And the CEO explained that they had refrained from certain markets because of corruption risk. Would your portfolio manager put a premium on their stock for that, or would they do the opposite?
I think that doing business in a bad country, difficult country with corruption would result in not a premium, definitely not, but a lower price. But on the other hand, just acting on a normal market in a normal state where, let's say, there is no corruption somewhere at all, they wouldn't have a premium just through that. Mm-hmm. But in an investing in a normal situation, you would consider so many other aspects before deciding to put a premium or discount on a share.
So it's fairly complicated. Sounds like a Facebook status. It's complicated. Emma, it's time to take some Menti questions, right?
We have questions, and please feel free to send in more. I'll start with one. To Professor Harrison Hong, what about the markets that don't exist now? For instance, the hydrogen one. Do you see the role of governments in creating those before we can achieve market efficiency?
Sorry, can you say you mean hydrogen markets?
Hydrogen, yeah.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I mean, I guess this is. I think this is a little bit more to these innovation issues, which I think are important, which I think Sarah had mentioned. That, for sure, if you kind of think about classical environmental economics, one version is taxing. Fossil fuel. The other version is basically subsidizing R&D, right? That, governments should subsidize R&D to basically generate new energy sources, and that could basically be a solution. I think it's a little hard to evaluate. I think governments already do that. I mean, there are basically these subsidies for all kinds of new energy options. I think a lot of these, Tesla, BYD, all these guys would not really exist without all these government subsidies. So I think we already have that type of solution on the table. It's just that, I guess you probably have to do even more, because I think it's not obvious these EVs are enough to basically deal with, this kind of rising concentration. I think kind of the plot that Patrick showed that, there's been a lot of progress if you just look at what's been happening, and yet the emissions keep going up, because I think some of the progress, like with EVs, are probably maybe not as much progress as we think. It's pretty expensive. It's still very carbon intensive, these EVs, and kind of makes everybody feels good to buy a Tesla, but doesn't save that much in terms of the overall CO2 emissions. So.
Thank you. Let's take another question from the audience, please.
Yes. So let's go with this. To Masi, why do you say that shareholders want to maximize returns? Why do you say that this is the only outcome shareholders would aim for?
I'm just sort of reasoning around what is the fastest way for us to get a sustainable world. And then if you have the two options of, one option is to get companies in general to care about a broader sort of number of stakeholders. And the other option is to use the current system with the current setup of how companies in general work. What path would I choose? And I would probably choose the path of the current system, but use that system because you have animal spirits in companies, you have strong incentives. If you use all of those incentives in the right way, and the way I'm saying what I think is the right way is to price externalities in the correct way, embed that in the financials of companies, then the products, the way they're producing them today, if it's carbon intense, will be more expensive, and that will create incentives for them to produce things in a cheaper way if the sustainable way is cheaper, and then that would help the world to move in the right path. So I'm just more reasoning around maybe it's better to use the same kind of framework we have today because we've been used to it since 1970, at least the quote from Milton Friedman was since then. So I just think that that could be a faster way. I'm not saying that it's impossible to over time have companies change their perspectives on stakeholders. I think that sort of gradually happens, but I just think it's going to be slower.
Yes, Sanna.
Yeah, if I can just build, because I think there are some areas clearly today where that is actually working. Because, for example, for us, if we're now looking at, okay, we need to make investments now into energy efficiency, that's a very easy investment for us to do because that's going to reduce cost for us. And by the way, that's very sustainable as well. Actually, it leads to less use of
It's a win-win.
It's a win-win, absolutely. But it's also following then the system that is there. It's sort of, it makes economic sense for us to do that irrespective of the sustainability or because of also the sustainability impact. The same thing with more and more consumers are maybe seeing that the single-use products that we have, that's generating waste. Can we get more reusable products? And can we get that? For us is then an incentive also, of course, then to invest into new innovations, into that area, trying to find washable solutions and so on. And that sort of triggers us to get there. Then I think that the tricky part is the time aspect that we were talking about here before, which is some of these investments, they are not, the investment horizon. When are we going to get return of it, and when do we need to pay back? And that's the challenge often. That's where you get this sort of trade-offs, or if we should call it that. And that's probably where solar panels, for example, for us, that's a long-term payoff than it would be for another investment, for example. And there maybe governments, subsidies or whatever other solutions can help. But I think the system as it is works in some areas, but there are some places where we have the longer-term return that is the challenging part.
Thank you. Eva, you wanted to...
Yeah, coming back to Sarah Kaplan, talking about innovation and the need for learning. This is not only from a company perspective, but also from all of us in the society and for us as investors. If we don't learn about the things that we now call its trade-off, we call it sustainability, we call it impact investing, we call it biodiversity, etc. It's a new society, and the one that has the best information can make the best decisions about the future. So we all need to learn a lot more, I think, because now we talk about these things as if they were something flying around here and hard to grasp. It's part of our daily life. It's just that we can't put them in an Excel sheet in a perfect way, but they still exist. So I agree with you. We need to put a price on the externalities, which they all are. But hopefully, if we will come here in 10 years' time, we will not talk about sustainability. It's the world as it is.
Thank you. Let's take another question.
To Harrison Hong, can you clarify what your model could tell us about greenwashing?
Oh, yeah, that was good. I didn't get a chance to talk about that. So I think this is kind of an important issue because I think a lot of the backlash about multi-stakeholderism have to do with greenwashing and allegations of greenwashing. So we have to be very specific about what it means. So I think generally, one version of greenwashing that people respond to is that they think, look, I'm not seeing a lot of change, right, in terms of outcomes, but I see lots of, CEOs raising lots of money, right, saying that they're green and getting kind of high prices, but I'm not seeing any real outcomes. That would be kind of one version of greenwashing, right? So you see a lot of academics. So, speaking of the pessimism, whenever I go to academic sustainability conferences, it's usually about greenwashing. Right? So basically, everybody has a paper kind of alleging that there's greenwashing going on vis-a-vis sustainable investing. Sustainable funds, they kind of bid up these green prices, but but these sustainable investors are kind of naive. They don't really know what's going on, and then the green firms are not really, so-called green firms are not doing anything, right? There's no abatement, there's no real change, et cetera. And I would say that kind of one reason we have to be a little careful about these allegations is that, if you think about what is in this model that I was just kind of presenting, the abatement outcome really depends on a range of stakeholders. It's not just really investors that are going to be driving this decision. And the reason is that investors themselves, sustainable funds, they're a relatively small fraction of the overall capital market, right? You're much more likely to find, other stakeholders, the community, right? The workers having green preferences, right? Than there are these investors, yeah. And I think there's a view out there that in fact, workers have a much better sense of what greenwashing really is because they actually work at the firm, right? They sort of know what's going on at the firm. Whereas investors, these big pension plans, they're kind of just like aloft, right? They kind of throw some money, they don't really know what's going on at the firm. Okay, I think it's in that backdrop that in the model, kind of one important prediction is that, you're going to get what, because it's a competitive system, you can get pretty disparate outcomes in terms of what funds will pay in terms of green. They might pay a lot for green, but may not get that much abatement, but mostly because it's a competitive process, right? Like, it's not that anybody is being malicious. It's just that in this competitive system, you're going to basically get just competitive pricing of different types of attributes as far as these stakeholders. And if you have a stakeholder who's very, very plentiful versus a stakeholder who's very rare, like let's say, a brown stakeholder that's really like important for avoiding all of these things, that person will get like a very, very good earnings, right, compared to somebody who's green. And that's going to look like greenwashing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything kind of malicious going on. In aggregate, you're still basically getting the right amount of abatement. And that's more like a mathematical theorem of the system, holding fixed that our grandchildren are not part of the stakeholders, so you may not then get like the overall right amount of abatement. We're probably getting the right amount of abatement for this current generation, if you ask me, but just kind of not relevant enough for like the future generation, because I think that's what all the scientific stuff is really about, the future generations. We're going to be long dead by the time any of the bad impacts of climate change are hit, right? And so of course nobody supports any of these policies. Right? They get that they want to be green. They care that their house is being kind of washed out a little bit. They have some sense of it, but mostly they see high gas prices, right? And mostly they see that they can't, these other costs are much higher when you start implementing these policies.
Thank you. I'd just like to add one follow-up question on that, and then I'm going to hand back to the hosts here. On the other side of greenwashing is, of course, green hushing. So any thoughts of the risks of hushing solutions, investments, etc., that are actually in the wake of greenwashing, the discussion that we can end up in silence and also not talking about what really works? Eva?
Just a comment on greenwashing, since I think Sarah said pessimism is not an option. Couldn't it be, why didn't we talk about greenwashing 10 years ago? Because nobody understood the things that were being done. One reason that we talk about greenwashing today, even though there are sad political issues, etc., could be the positive fact that so many more of us are interested in these issues and know a lot more about them. So it could be a good sign.
Thank you. Thank you. Any thoughts on the green hushing risks here? Do you experience any sort of hesitation when you communicate your sustainability work?
Not necessarily, and I think I'm just thinking also what we discussed earlier as well, all this reporting coming now with the transparency, and that's sort of a drive as well. So I think to some extent maybe that will solve itself somehow, that you need to be more transparent. Society wants that, and let's be transparent about the right things then.
Would you like to add?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of hesitation, to be honest. You're trying to balance being transparent about what you're doing, but then always making sure you're not going too far and you don't promise what you cannot achieve.
Which is good, I guess.
It is good, but it's a balancing act, to be absolutely honest. We have our sort of legal counsel always trying to stop us from saying anything whatsoever. But yeah, we try to be vocal about it, but at the same time, you never know what the benefit of hindsight will do to you. So 10, 15 years down the line, someone might have a view on that you didn't know what you were doing, and maybe you don't really, you're just trying to achieve something. So yeah, it is complicated to communicate what you're trying to do.
But one thing, just to build on that, because I think there's also, again, coming back to the stakeholder you're having your dialogue with, and what we said earlier as well here from Professor Bolton as well, was we need also to get the politics and policies to help.
Indeed.
It's not just the industry. And I think what I'm seeing more and more, at least in industry, is that companies are trying to be clear about, we don't know the route yet to get there, but we want to get to this place, but we need help to get there. And somehow we also need to get into that, okay, we can't overpromise, but we can also show that it's not easy. And that's okay not to be easy, as long as we kind of are clear about where it's not easy and then try to solve that together.
Thank you. Thank you very much, all of you. This is complicated, and you have shared your insights and made us a bit wiser, indeed. And let's just continue this super important work. And I'd like to end with your perspective. The AI grandchildren in the boardroom. We're not going to see them, but we could visualize them, right? Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hand back now to Maria Kibos and to Emma Sjöström to say thank you and some final words. Give all the panelists a warm hand.
Thank you.